Students for Freedom of Expression, and I'm glad all of you could make it out tonight. It's a real pleasure to see all these faces who want to see controversial profs, and it's been a real blessing to have Ricardo Duchesne, Professor Ricardo Duchesne, appear at the university without any sort of, problems with the university, any sort of roadblocks. They've been really helpful to us, so I'd like to thank the University of British Columbia for allowing this event and helping me so much by helping me organize. I'm an amateur when it comes to this thing, but they've been really charitable with us, so I'd like to first thank them. The next set of people that I'd like to thank is everyone who's filming, so Prism Media, Ina, and of course this young woman here. Thank you for filming. It's really nice to have people outside of this event to be able to see it. Outside of that, I'd like to thank you all again for coming, because without you guys it would be almost impossible to hold these kinds of events. I'm glad there's interest in hearing these professors. I'd like to give the floor to Lindsay Shepard, who tried to organize an event like this before and was stopped, so I'm glad that I am in a way better than Lindsay Shepard. So there you go.
Hi everyone, I'm just visiting from Waterloo, Ontario, where I'm currently living, and I was just looking on Eventbrite and I was very surprised to see this event. The same week I'm going to be in Vancouver, so I was like, okay, cool, I'm coming. And I was surprised because I tried to bring Dr. Ricardo Duchesne to the University of Waterloo in April. And it was going to be an event with Dr. Duchesne in conversation with Big Goldie, so we were going to have like an academic perspective and then a non-academic perspective on borders and multiculturalism. But it didn't happen. And that's because the University of Waterloo wanted $28,500 in security. So $28,500. That's more than what my TA salary was in a year. So. And so I'm frankly pretty surprised to hear that the university was helpful to you to help organize this. And did you even have to pay anything in security?
No, they haven't even asked us.
Yeah, so that's amazing, and I'm so glad that a student group was able to bring Dr. Duchesne, because this is going to be a great presentation. So, without further ado, Dr. Ricardo Duchesne is a Canadian historical sociologist and professor at the University of New Brunswick. He is the author of Canada in Decay, Mass Migration, Diversity, and Ethnic Side of EuroCanadians. I believe the book, you have them with you in your have them after? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Well, I will introduce Dr. Duchesne.
All right, so I'd like to thank Nicholas Kosovic for making this possible. I think it's great that a student had the courage to do this because of what Lindsay just said. It's not easy to put it together. And I'll start soon. And we have a lot of time, and I want the argument to be out there, and I'm going to read it, and then we'll take questions, and I do hope that there are people here that really challenge me. I don't just want sympathizers. It's great to have sympathizers, but if there are a few of you that disagree, you're most welcome to debate me. My side is very open-minded, unlike the other side. We love to exchange ideas, and so don't hesitate. I was just about to start. So. That's great. I see more diversity here than I did when I was walking around. So all right, so I'm going to... So it's good. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. So the paper will take no more than 40 minutes, and then we have a lot of time for open discussion. I have 8 big claims to make. My first claim is Canada is not a nation of immigrants, but a nation created by settlers and indigenous EuroCanadians. So that is my first claim. There is no historical evidence supporting the claim that Canada is a nation of immigrants. Most of the men and women who built Canada were native to this nation. There is no evidence either to support the claim that from the very beginning, Canada was a multiracial place, the destination of a constant flow of new immigrants of varying ethnicities. Canada's immigration experience was overwhelmingly Irish, British, Scottish, and European until the 1970s. The Quebecois and the Acadians were a people created through the fecundity of the women, not immigration. The Loyalists, too, were not immigrants, but settlers native to the soils of British North America. Before Confederation, there were only 2 quite limited periods of substantial immigration, from 1783 to 1812 and from 1830 to 1850. In these 2 periods, the immigrants were overwhelmingly of British origin. Immigration was not a major factor in population growth from 1850 to the end of the 19th century. In 1867, 79% of Canadian residents had been born in Canada. From 1871 to 1891, a high fertility rate allowed the population to grow from 3.7 to 4.8 million. Immigration to New France from 1608 to 1760 consisted of 10,000 settlers only, and thereafter it was almost non-existent. Immigration contributed about 1/7 to the total population growth of New France from its beginnings in the early 1600s to its conquest in 1763. The French-speaking population numbered about 90,000 by the 1770s. And thereafter, until the late 1800s, the population expanded rapidly, with women having 5.6 surviving children on average. The increase in population in Quebec during the 1800s was due mainly to the continuing high fertility rate. By 1950, the Quebec population was almost 4 million. This increase was primarily a result of continuing high fertility rates. Only in the 1970s, Montreal saw an increasing inflow of non-European immigrants. Between 1896 and 1914, Canada did experience high immigration levels, with 2.5 to 3 million arriving within this period. However, the ethnic composition of the nation remained 84% British and Quebecois, while the European component rose to 9%. Between 1941 and 1962, the population of Canada increased from 11.5 million to 18.5 million, largely as a result of Canada's extremely high domestic birth rates. It was only after the imposition of multiculturalism in 1971 that immigrants from outside the West started to arrive in large numbers. Canada was created by native EuroCanadians. All the institutions, legal system, educational curriculum, transformation of wilderness into productive farms, all the cities, the parliamentary traditions, the churches, the entire infrastructure of railways, ports, shipping industries, and highways were created by hard-working EuroCanadians. Moreover, it needs to be said that those who were not born in Canada should also be described as settlers, not immigrants. Almost all the men and women who came to Canada from the British Isles and elsewhere in Europe before 1914 were settlers seeking survival in a land sparsely populated and devoid of modern development. I am saying this in accordance with all the dictionary definitions I have examined. The new Oxford English Dictionary, for example, is very clear in defining immigrant as, quote, a person who comes to live permanently in a foreign country. Settler, however, is, quote, a person who settles in an area typically with no or few previous inhabitants. While immigrants do not create a new society, settlers create a new society. My second claim, multiculturalism recognizes the collective culture of minorities and immigrant groups, while targeting the collective culture of EuroCanadians. The theory of multicultural citizenship advocated by Wilkin Lika and Charles Taylor is stained by a double standard in recognizing the deep bond that minorities as human beings have to their culture and ethnicity, while categorizing any form of ethno-cultural identity by EuroCanadians as racist and illiberal. Kinlika often asserts, quote, most people have a very strong bond to their own culture. And then he says that forcing immigrants to shed their distinctive heritage and assimilate entirely to the existing cultural norms would amount to the suppression of a very strong disposition in the human condition. The Canadians who developed the theory of multicultural citizenship, and Canadians are really responsible for this theory of multiculturalism, are known as liberal communitarians. I agree with liberal communitarians that individual rights presuppose the existence of a community of people, and that liberalism contains within its premises the idea that humans should have a right to have their cultural identities recognized, because such recognition is essential to the self-fulfillment of the individual. I wonder then why Kinlika and Taylor care only about the cultural rights and ethnic attachments of minorities, but not about the same human need EuroCanadians may have to fulfill themselves as individuals within their own cultural landscape. While minorities are distinguished by culture and by ethnicity, the majority Anglophone culture is identified only through its language and certain modern amenities. English culture is portrayed as a deracinated, neutralized sphere consisting of modern conveniences, economic, educational, and social institutions, intended in principle to serve anyone regardless of cultural background. The English are mere possessors of individual rights, whereas every other ethnic group enjoys both individual rights and group rights. Whenever Kinlika and Taylor identify English Europeans by history and culture, it is scornfully as colonizers and racists. The only cultural attribute Europeans are allowed to celebrate is multiculturalism. The words pride, cultural particularity, and culturally meaningful lives are reserved exclusively for ethnic immigrant groups. Kinlika explicitly says that multiculturalism cannot succeed as long as, quote, native-born ethnic European citizens with a strong sense of national identity or national pride are allowed a voice in the public arena, regularly labeling those who disagree with mass immigration as xenophobic and intolerant. This is patently unfair. Just as minorities have been granted the collective right to be concerned with the ways in which forced assimilation may impact negatively on their cultural identity, the Euro-Canadian majority should have a collective right to be concerned about the ways their Canadian heritage, customs, and historical affinities are being decimated by the combined effects of mass immigration and anti-white propaganda. My third claim: Western nations were founded on both individual rights and ethnic nationalist affinities. It is often said that Western nations were meant to be based on an inclusive form of liberal civic identity, defined not by culture and ethnicity, but by liberal values alone, such as equality under the law, separation of church and state, and individual rights, which can be shared by any human across the world. This is not true. European nations were created on the basis of a shared language, shared heritage, a common faith, and a common ethnic ancestry. This is amply supported by the foremost expert on nationalism, Anthony D. Smith, and more recently by Azar Gatt's book, Nations, the Long History and Deep Roots of Political Ethnicity and Nationalism. Gatt goes further than Smith in employing the science of sociobiology to show that, quote, nations are rooted in primordial human sentiments of kin culture affinity, solidarity, and mutual cooperation, evolutionarily engraved in human nature. And of course, ethnicity is by far, he says, the most important factor in national identity. History shows, in fact, that those states possessing a high degree of ethnic homogeneity, where ancestors lived for generations, England, France, Italy, Belgium, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and others, were the ones with the strongest liberal traits, constitutions, and institutions. That is why minority rights became a legitimate component of these liberal nations. By contrast, those states or empires, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, composed of multiple ethnic groups, were the ones enraptured by illiberal forms of ethnic nationalism and intense rivalries over identities and political boundaries. Research papers are showing that as diversity increases in the West, communities tend, in the words of Robert Putnam, to distrust their neighbors, regardless of the color of their skin, to withdraw even from close friends as diversity increases, to expect the worst from their community and its leaders, to volunteer less in community activities, give less to charity, vote less, and to huddle unhappily in front of the television. Claim number 4. Canada was founded as an Anglo-Quebecois ethno-state, combined with civic rights. So don't let them tell you that ethno-nationalism is inconsistent with liberalism. It has been consistent throughout most of its history. I disagree with Janet Ansenstad's fabrication that the fathers of Confederation intended to give the new country a civic identity, that is, inculcate a sense of nationhood that is based only on equality of rights and that is inclusive of all cultures and races, rather than a country ensuring British, French cultural values. While the British North America Act was a rejection of the subordination of French Canadians to the majority British culture, and an endorsement of the central liberal principle that the laws of the land must apply equally to all, it is incorrect to infer that the fathers were not concerned with the collective cultural identity of Canada. At the time of Confederation, about 70% of the population spoke English and 30% French. The fathers took it for granted that with language came culture, and that the French and English were the two founding races. They understood that Francophones saw themselves as a distinct nation, a distinct collectivity of people within Canada, while the Anglophones did not see themselves as a distinct cultural nation. They did see themselves as a people of British heritage, who were creating a majority British Canadian nation that would acknowledge the French majority in Quebec, but would see itself as an integral part of the British Empire. French Canadians would gain control of a provincial government with its own legislature, civil code, French as the official language in Quebec, and religious minorities enjoying the right to separate schools in all provinces. The BNA Act was a document consistent with liberal principles while committed to the collective well-being of Canada as an ethno-state rather than as a mere aggregation of abstract and ruthless individuals. Claim number 5. Multiculturalism is not about minority rights, but about erasing the cultural identity of Western peoples. The theory of multicultural citizenship has been lauded as an effort to extend equality of rights to previously excluded groups inside Western nations. The actual reality is that this theory is part of a radical program aimed at populating the entire Western world with millions of foreigners turned immigrants with special group rights in order to break apart the ethnic identities of EuroCanadians and Europeans generally. It almost seems innocent enough when Kimlicka says that just as indigenous peoples and historic minorities should be granted minority rights, so should permanently settled immigrant groups. But he's not talking about rights for a static group of settled immigrants. He is formulating, in his words, a transformative form of multicultural citizenship for a new Canada dedicated to the integration of millions of new immigrants. The aim of multiculturalism, in Kimlicka's words, is to bring about a Canada that will never again be identified as Christian and white. This theory was not formulated for Canada only, or so-called immigrant nations like Australia and the United States. The major theories of multiculturalism have spent a lot of time trying to persuade Europeans that if their nations are to protect minority rights, they too must import millions of immigrants. Kimlicka notes that, quote, in most Western countries, explicit state-sponsored discrimination against ethnic, racial, or religious minorities had largely ceased by the 1960s and 70s. He knows that Western nations were already legislating through the 70s and 90s a variety of laws and policies designed to afford cultural self-determination and territorial rights to minorities such as the Quebecois, Basque, Catalans, Welsh, and Aboriginals. The theory of multiculturalism, or immigrant multiculturalism, was not intended to protect the rights of established minorities, but was intended to create a totally new multiracial identity across the Western world by granting minority rights to millions of foreign immigrants. Claim number 6. Pierre Trudeau aimed at the separation of cultural nationality from the Canadian state. There is nothing in the core principles of liberalism requiring Europeans to embrace immigrant diversity. You can be consistently a liberal and completely reject immigration. Right now, close all the doors. To the contrary, diversification without open dialogue is an illiberal ideology rooted in cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism is an outgrowth of Marxism, which focuses on radically altering the cultures and ethnicities of the West. But it cannot be denied, however, that Western liberal states have a weak conception of their historically rooted collective identity. This made them susceptible to cultural Marxist infiltration and corruption. Liberals have an imaginary conception of their nation-states as associations created by isolated individuals reaching a contract amongst themselves in abstraction from any prior community for the sole purpose of ensuring their natural right to life, liberty, and happiness. Liberals have a predilection to whitewash the fact that their liberal states, like all states, were forcibly created by a people with a common language, heritage, racial characteristics, and a sense of territorial acquisition involving the derogation of outgroups. This is why Canadian leaders acceded so easily to Trudeau's multicultural program. It is not that Canadians were devoid of any sense of collective identity. Canadians did understand that the English and the French were distinctive people. Strong immigration restrictions prevailed until the 1960s against people deemed to be members of ethnic outgroups. The weakness of liberal leaders lay in their imaginary belief that their liberal rights were the sole founding principles of Canada, which blinded them from the factual reality that their nations were created by ethnic groups against other groups with different territorial interests. The experience of World War II intensified this imaginary belief to the point that Western leaders, the same ethnocentric nations that fought Nazism, started believing that any form of collective identity was inherently illiberal. They started believing that every nation should be bound together by transnational common values, by universal human rights. They also started believing that all humans, regardless of nationality, should be afforded the same rights to life, liberty, and economic well-being as the citizens of their own nations. Pierre Trudeau's anti-nationalism needs to be seen in this context, in the context of this intellectual climate. The conclusion that Pierre Trudeau reached was that Canadian leaders must separate once and for all the concepts of state and culture. No one ethnic group, neither the Anglo in Canada nor the Quebecois in Quebec, must lay claim over Canada's cultural identity. Just as religion was separated from the state, so must culture be separated from the state. Canada must be identified as a polyethnic society, and in this way, Canada would truly become a liberal democratic society. A nation, in his view, that prioritizes the ethno-culture of the majority and thereby establishes a nationalism that elevates the interests of this majority above the interests of minorities cannot be truly democratic. The only expectation on the part of the government would be to ensure that all Canadians learn the official languages and accepted the values of multicultural liberalism. There would be 2 official languages, but no official culture. Trudeau further argued that creating a Canada without a national cultural identity would make this nation a model for the solution of ethnic strife and nationalist aggrandizement across the world. Canadian federalism would be, quote, an experiment of major proportions, a brilliant prototype for the molding of tomorrow's civilization. Accordingly, Trudeau rejected the bicultural nationalism which was being proposed during these years by many Canadians for a multicultural identity. He tried to justify this decision saying that, quote, biculturalism does not properly describe our society. Multiculturalism is more accurate. But Trudeau was not really describing Canada as it was in the 1970s, a nation with a population that was 96% European in 1971. He was envisioning multiculturalism as a project for the future against the past. Canada was not going to become a brilliant prototype merely by acknowledging its intra-European diversity or by fighting discrimination against a small number of long-established minorities. Cultural nationalism was a major source of human conflict and degradation of the human rights of individuals. The way to break cultural nationalism, he concluded, was to populate the nation with different cultures. Hugh Forbes, a supporter of Trudeau's dream, has observed that it was clear from the moment official multiculturalism was announced in 1971 that its success would, quote, obviously depend on the deliberate diversification of the Canadian population. Claim number 7. The Charter of Rights is guided by human rights principles against Canadian cultural traditions while protecting and enhancing the collective culture of minorities. This multicultural agenda would be embodied in the Charters of Rights enacted in 1982. The foremost legal experts view the Charter as a transformative constitution that elevated to the status of supreme law the, quote, traditional core values of democracy as adapted to the reality of the post-World War II multicultural nation state. These words come from Lorraine Wainwright, professor at the Faculty of Law, Toronto. She's emphatic in viewing the Charter as a document that emerged of the determination of Western nations after the experiences of World War II to ensure higher law guarantees of the core values of liberal democracies, strengthened by human rights standards. Brian Dixon, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, also viewed the Charter as, quote, the logical culmination of Canadian developments in the field of human rights. It builds on provincial and federal human rights codes and the Canadian Bill of Rights. The novelty of the Charter, they argue, was that its transformative aspirations were not chained to Canadian legal history, but were really transnational, the hallmark of liberal democracy in the aftermath of the Second World War. The transformative aspiration was to promote diversity and human rights in Canada in contradistinction to any, quote, traditional conservative moral code based on shared culture, history, religion, and ethnicity. The same charter that declares that minority cultures must be protected was also saying that it would be based on universal human rights principles that would go against the traditional custom values of the majority culture. Every remnant of Canada's British identity had to go, including the history of Canada as a nation founded by the English and the French. The Charter, Section 15 in particular, which affirms equal rights regardless of race, religion, or sex, was said to represent, quote, one of the most important and dynamic forces on the road to social justice. By dynamic, legal experts meant that Canadians would be able to draw on equality provisions to eliminate every remaining inequality as defined by the current and future elites educated in our cultural Marxist universities. They took it as a given that Canadians as a people that Canadians are a people marching to a future time when there will be equal social justice. They never defined social justice, but simply took for granted that the equality provisions are a dynamic force intended to ensure social change and equality. What about the truly dynamic and transformative force that is immigration in bringing hundreds of thousands of individuals from collectivist cultures, creating a cultural reality that is bound to influence the meaning of Section 27, which says that the Charter, quote, should be interpreted in a manner consistent with the preservation and enhancement of the multicultural heritage of Canada. Will Canada find itself in a situation in which semi-autonomous groups wishing to preserve their special characteristics may interpret Section 27 to mean that they have a right to preserve cultural characteristics that are deemed to be essential to the human dignity of the members of this group, even if this entails less respect for the principle of individual rights? I understand it would be misleading to think that Section 27 grants every immigrant group a similar constitutional status to survive as distinct communities as it grants to Aboriginal peoples, the national minority of Quebec, denominational communities, and English and French linguistic minorities. I understand that Section 27 has to be seen in the context of the other individual rights protected by the Charter. The Charter, however, does grant special rights to non-European cultural groups that can claim there was and continues to be discrimination and lack of opportunities for cultural expression. Section 15.2 of the Charter says that the government has the constitutional right, quote, to create special programs aimed at improving the situation of individuals who are members of groups that have historically experienced discrimination in Canada. Again, I understand that it would be far-fetched to take these words to mean that the Charter, in the words of the constitutional expert Joseph Magnet, grants maintenance claims to immigrant minorities, that is, group rights to, quote, maintain intact indefinitely into the future the distinguishing features of identity that bind them together as a distinctive society. But this interpretation on its own is inadequate in that it offers a strictly legalistic account of the meaning of multiculturalism and group rights without the slightest awareness of the wider social and philosophical meaning of multiculturalism, its meaning in our universities, media, minority associations, and thousands of publications. It is flawed as well in ignoring the truly dynamic force of mass immigration and the rapidly changing ethnic balance of power in Canada. Joseph Magnet, the same guy who says that immigrant minorities are not getting maintenance claims, actually appears to be aware that the meaning of Section 27 may be open to strong collectivist interpretations in the future. Although he writes in a purely conceptual manner, he employs the concept of structural ethnicity to refer to, quote, the capacity of a collectivity to perpetuate itself, resist assimilation, and propagate its beliefs and practices. He even says that, quote, to the extent that structural ethnicity principle inheres in Section 27, a dramatic impact on Canada's charter system results. He notes, Magnet notes, that Section 27, after all, fell into place at the insistence of immigrant minorities. Section 27, quote, must be taken as claims for greater power welling up from ethnic minorities, unprotected by the kinds of constitutional guarantees that the Quebecois and the Aboriginals get. And he says that it's very close to maintenance claims. He then says that immigrant minorities could well seek to limit individual rights for the sake of preserving the essential features of their cultural identity. I'll skip a bit here. It seems to me that Section 27 will be interpreted differently in the coming decades as immigrant groups continue to grow exponentially and continue to form ethnic enclaves across Canada. The fact that no one cares to offer time limits as to how long immigrants will require special group rights is inseparable from the more pertinent fact that no one cares to offer any limits on the number of immigrants that should come every year and on the number of years that Canada should be open to mass immigration. We need a proper scientific analysis of ethnic group interests. Numerous scientific studies demonstrate that all living organisms survive inside in-groups, in competition with out-groups. In-group cooperation and preference is an evolutionary strategy consistent with the survival, enhancement, and protection of one's own herd, family, or people. Such altruistic dispositions as sharing, loyalty, and caring are exhibited primarily and intensively within in-groups rather than toward a universal we in disregard for one's people. Conflict escalation between ethnic groups is lower when physical barriers exist between them. We all know that Europeans tend to be more individualistic, less collectivist in their ethnic awareness, and that Europeans have a unique capacity to think in universal moral terms, which is why they originated the Enlightenment, a rational system of law, and the method of modern science. Non-Europeans are more collective and racially aware and more inclined to practice ethnic nepotism. Whites do exhibit ethnocentrism, but implicitly in their voting patterns, choice of residential areas, and schools for their children. Liberal communitarians do not use the language of evolutionary psychology, the guys who formulated the theory of multiculturalism, but their view that humans have a natural need to have their cultural identity validated amounts to the same idea. In his discussion of multiculturalism in the Charter, Joseph Magnet, and it actually is the best discussion of multiculturalism in the Charter by Joseph Magnet, he actually appeals to findings in social psychology to show how important it is for individuals to belong in a group of people with a similar culture. He says that, quote, social psychologists have demonstrated that the individual self is incomplete without integration into a social group. He adds that voluntary identification with an ethnic group completes a significant aspect of personality. And then he says, attacks on cultural heritage are thus attacks on the individual selves of the ethnic group members. One may ask, do social psychologists have anything to say about how Anglo-Canadian individuals may feel incomplete without integration into their own cultural group? Is Anglo-ethnicity a significant aspect of the personality of Anglo individuals? Are attacks on the cultural heritage of Anglos attacks on the individual members who make up the Anglo group? Magnet does not ask those questions. No one in Canada asks those questions. Finally, claim number 8. The Charter can be used to defend Euro-Canadian collective cultural identity. This double standard against Euro-Canadian identity has to be openly discussed. If Euro-Canadians are going to survive as the rightful majority in Canada, they have to discuss it. The meaning of multiculturalism and what the Charter means by multiculturalism will be determined by the proportion of non-Europeans in Canada and the willingness of Euro-Canadians to affirm their collective identity. The current situation in which Euro-Canadians are under the obligation of reconstructing their culture according to transnational values formulated by anonymous human rights lawyers and globalist academics, while simultaneously expected to understand the human need minorities have to belong in a cultural group, cannot go on much longer. If we are to overcome this double standard, Section 27 must be interpreted in a manner consistent with the preservation and enhancement of the culture of all ethnic groups in Canada, including Euro-Canadians. The Multiculturalism Act of 1988 clearly states that all citizens, including Euro-Canadians, are equal and have the freedom to preserve, enhance, and share their cultural heritage. The founding of Canada by Euro-Canadians is part of this heritage. In so much as multiculturalism uses the language of collective rights to guarantee the survival of minority groups, it follows that Euro-Canadians have a group right to use multiculturalism to preserve their identity as a group in Canada, facing immigration patterns that are fast reducing them to a demonized minority. The establishment wants to hide this constitutional reality from Euro-Canadians. Globalist conservatives want Euro-Canadians to act as individuals without group rights, while lamely begging masses of immigrants arriving yearly to embrace this individualism. They're oblivious to the fact that immigrants come from collectivist cultures and that second-generation immigrants are only assimilating to a deracinated, globalist, anti-white set of nations. They do not understand that current demographic trends will tilt the balance of ethnic power decisively in the favor of groups pursuing ethnic interests in competition with Euro-Canadians. As Asians, Blacks, Aboriginals, Indians, Chinese, and non-whites generally express in full their group rights in ethnic voting patterns and through the creation of associations, clubs, and churches, Euro-Canadians will have no option but to assert their constitutional right to engage in white identity politics. That's it.
All right, so we'll open it up to questions, and we have lots of time for questions. So yeah, feel free to ask some questions.
So you said around 1970 or the 70s, things started to shift in Canada as far as the immigration. Is there a particular reason that you think that happened? Like, was there a shift in the media that made it more, I guess, acceptable amongst the population for them to allow for the shift of the politics or what's going on with the immigration?
In this book can indicate, the last part is dedicated to trying to answer that question. And I think it's important to understand that what happened and is happening in Canada is not unique to Canada. Many people have this notion, and the politicians repeat it over and over again, and so do the academics, when they should know better, but they don't mind deceiving people. They have this notion that Canada is somehow uniquely multicultural, so that it just happened here. Maybe it was just Pierre Trudeau. The truth is, this is a widespread Western phenomenon. Australia took a bit longer, they always take longer, but in 1975 they also opened their borders. New Zealand, the United States in 1965, and soon after it was Britain, and now it's the whole Western world, and only the Western world. So that when you seek an explanation, it has to be an explanation that can account for this Western-wide phenomenon. It's not just Canada, it's a Western-wide phenomenon. And it really is a complicated explanation. It has roots in Western history, in the radical aspects of the Enlightenment. It has roots in white psychology, the way they are. And that takes us into a complicated discussion. And then you can look for closer events to explain this. I emphasize a lot the experience of the Second World War. I think the Second World War was used by many radical people to try and create this notion that you could really not be a liberal nation if you did not first grant minority rights, which I think is true, you have to have minority rights, but if you don't embrace the diversification of your population, abolish the notion that races exist. So, it's a UN document. One of the first things they did was that races don't exist, therefore it doesn't really matter which kind of ethnic group or race is in your nation. And if a German nation, for example, says, well, no, Germany has always been German, and we want to keep German, by the 1980s into the 90s, that came to be associated with neo-Nazis and is on the rise. So it has a number of explanations, because you have to take account of the experiences across the West. I mean, I list 4 reasons. One of them is that a liberal nation was said to be a nation that doesn't have any ethnic, cultural, collective identity. And this is kind of tied to the Second World War as well. And I also believe that radical left is infiltrated, the way cultural Marxism said. Many people talk about infiltration of schools, of churches, and things of that nature. I believe the biggest infiltration was the infiltration of liberalism itself. Because liberalism is uniquely Western. It doesn't exist in any other culture. Even when it's brought there, they don't quite know what to make of it. And they don't really believe in a lot of its things. So liberalism was infiltrated so that whatever collective aspect there was to it, and it was always a collective aspect that has to coexist with the individual rights aspect. Whatever collective aspect was there, they simply took it out and said, that's like the remaining tradition, the remaining or neo-Nazism is inside there. And so they just pull it out of it. And Pierre Trudeau, when you look at his writing, it's very clear. Culture must be pulled out of Western nations. Western nations must not have a cultural identity. That having a cultural identity is itself illiberal.
What do we do about the fact that without the high immigration rate, Canadian culture is basically non-viable? It's basically a non-viable society.
Without immigration.
Because the fertility rate is so low.
Yeah.
I think that that's a central issue here. It's not really, unless we can deal with that question, it's not resolvable.
I disagree. I mean, it's interesting because the left never would argue that our economy needs to import a lot of labor, but now they just embrace that viewpoint.
I mean that we're going to shrink if you don't have immigration.
First of all, most of the wealthy nations in the world have very small populations. Finland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden. Well, Sweden is messing up because it opened off its borders, so it has now systematic raping all over the place. When you look at the wealthiest nation per capita, where the students do the best, the high-ranking in education, high-ranking in health, they're all small populations.
I understand, but so I'll be more specific.
Yeah.
The replacement rate.
Japan, then we can use Japan. Japan has, I think, the worst ratio between an aging population out of work that needs to be supported and an incoming generation that can work. The ratio is the worst. This is very small, the incoming working population, the aging population growing and growing very large. And yet, despite the fact that the globalists keep pressuring Japanese leaders, you got to diversify like everybody else, they do little bits here and there, will bring 100 students to teach English, that kind of thing. But they're not opening up yet. And one of the answers they gave, first, encourage women to have children. Encourage something as simple as just marry, have children. Now that's not easy because in an affluent society, and it has happened in the past, it happened in the Roman times, the fertility rate in Rome really went down when Rome was doing really well because human beings become comfortable, they like to party, hang around, women became slightly more liberated. So it is not going to be easy to get our contemporary population to have more children, but nevertheless, it is a good argument to make and to start an argument to bring back more traditional relations between the sexes. Another thing is automation. Automation is rapidly taking over. What do you think all the people that are coming in with low skills are going to do, including many here that don't have the skills? They're redundant. So we have increasingly a population of people that will have nothing to do. And the elites know that. You just Google and start clicking automation, and you realize that many types of jobs are disappearing and about to disappear. So we don't need a massive population. What has happened is the globalists love the Indian-Chinese model of development. Huge cities, masses of cars, masses of shopping people, real estate bonanza. They don't like the Iceland model. A very small population. People don't replace their goods continuously. Highways are not breaking continuously, and you need to repair them and put more money into it. You don't have gigantic shopping malls. So that model, which actually achieves the highest standards of living, the globalists don't like.
How would you specifically describe the relationship between race and culture?
Race and culture. Well, after the Second World War, it was decided by the elites that race does not exist, that it is a construct. These are the very same people that can easily identify white supremacists and can easily talk about white privilege. But if you say anything nice about white culture, they say you cannot identify what is what. They start questioning it. But in the past, people did say there was a connection. I don't believe that race is a foundation which then determines everything else. I'm not of that viewpoint. But when you think of what are the big factors in history and society that we always talk about as being major shapers, I say demography, the economy, technology, the economy, religion, climate, the environment, and I would add race to that. But they panic. So the social sciences today, they have many holes in their thinking because they just refuse to consider race. So race to me is a factor among all the important factors, but it's not like a foundation. Because if it were a foundation, then you have too many things to explain. ancient Greece achieved heights of cultural creativity that they never have since, with a very small population. So these are, you can say the same people, and you can say they mix and that sort of thing. But you can say the same about the Spaniards. They had the golden age in the 16th century, and at that time you may have said that the Spaniards have an incredible race, but then they went into rapid decline. Then when the British were at the top, the British was said to be the best race. Look at them today. I mean, so race is a factor, but I don't believe in this notion that it's like the root that then explains everything else. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, I think we probably disagree on some things, but I appreciate your opinions. When you were talking about Pierre Trudeau establishing 2 official languages but failing to like establish an official culture, so I was thinking, like, how does one go about creating and enforcing an official culture in a liberal democracy where you, like,
Pretty much the same way it was done the moment nation states were created in Europe. The left is right that nations are constructed, but it is wrong in thinking that that's all there is to a nation. Nations are constructed on the basis of a certain historical, ethnic, religious reality on the ground. So if you look at France, even as late as the 1800s, it was a very divided nation in terms of multiple ethnicities, dialects, variations in religious beliefs, costumes, cuisines, and so on. So they had to construct a more organized, cohesive national identity, and the state consciously went about saying, you know, we have to have an official French language, and this is how you spell the real French language. And we're going to teach it in the primary schools all across these lands that we call France. And there are borders where you have a lot of Germans or Italians, like it gets fuzzy. But by and large, they sort of constructed a more cohesive national identity. And that construction was made possible by the actual common heritage and reality in those lands. Those lands that were too German didn't belong to France. So, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but France constructed itself that way at the same time that it had a liberal democracy. Canada fought in the Second World War as, in many ways, a far freer society than it is today in terms of freedom of speech, in the sense that we're not trying to mold and create an enriching, diverse character and you're all the same. They let people more or less do what they do. And Canada was a liberal democratic nation, and they fought Nazism, and they had immigration restrictions. So you see it over and over again. But as I said, the cultural Marxists, in a very cunning way, in all the universities, when they realized Marxism by itself and communism is a disaster, they said, let's just grab liberalism and make it our own. And they succeeded in doing that. Yes?
Okay. I'd just like to offer an opinion, if I may. I was born in 1954. I'm 64 years old. I grew up in Montreal. I attended primary school that doesn't exist today. It was, the educators were an order from Ireland called the Presentation Brothers. By the time I graduated from grade school, I was in PK. Then when I went to high school, again, a stern education environment, and I was educated. As I watched the decades pass by, education has decreased considerably. And so we have a massive population in Canada that is uninformed. For example, there's very few people that are familiar with civics. And what is civics? It's the rights and privileges and obligations and duties of the citizen and knowing how to govern his lives. The other thing is, a lot of, first of all, I'm a humanist. Color of skin and that sort of stuff is not an issue with me. But if you look at, for example, Mexico, you have people migrating to North America from Mexico. What's wrong with Mexico? On the human level, as neighbors and things, I had absolutely nothing. But they come from a society, but there's a lot of illegitimate behavior, corruption, things like that at every level of government. So you have a group of people that have a very high tolerance for corruption. So I think the whole thing, personally, if you ask me over the since the Second World War, I think all of this is engineered. This isn't a coincidence. That's my opinion.
That diversity was engineered.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think the lack of education, the quality of education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I think this is all engineered. This is not a coincidence.
All right. Let me take one here, then he was critical.
I heard a question earlier about what is the relationship between culture and ethnicity, and I sort of want to expand on that a bit. This question: how does one identify, or what constitutes a legitimate and natural evolution of a cultural or national identity versus one that is, let's say, less favorable, less natural, more imposed? What constitutes just Western culture changing itself, and what constitutes it being changed? So to clarify more, like earlier you noted that the sort of changes you're talking about in Western culture are actually happening all over the world. It's not Canada specific. And what those cultures share, like Australia and England, is a philosophical tradition, literary tradition, like ethnic heritage. And so maybe those changes are actually emerging as a consequence of modern developments in technology and institutions interacting with the natural development of those ideas in that context. So
Right, I know what you're getting at, and I would say you have to make a distinction between globalization and globalism. The establishment wants to confuse students and to tell them, students, what's happening here is just part of globalization. It's happening across the world. We're all interconnecting, we're moving around. It's not true. Globalization is inescapable. You cannot self-enclose yourself. You'll end up like Albania. So you can't do that. And Japan has multiple links with the rest of the world, but they're not globalists. They are proud of their identity and they want to keep it that way. South Korea the same, Mexico the same. In fact, all non-Western nations want their identity because it's a human instinct to want to preserve your identity. The young generation is the one that is the most brainwashed, so that they're told and given music from all sounds. They're really promoting race mixing like there is no tomorrow, relentlessly, because they know that the more race mix, especially is for whites, the more whites race mix, then they will for sure don't know who the hell they are. And if anything, they'll side with the non-white side, because that's the natural tendency. So to me, this is not, oh, it's just happening all across the world. To me, this is an orchestrated, planned out process that is happening only in Western nations.
I was more interested in precisely what constitutes, for example, you said Japan would like to preserve its culture. Precisely what constitutes what an authentic model of their culture is? Because of course cultures change through time. So what are the things you got to preserve? How do you identify it?
That's another thing. Western culture throughout history has been the one culture that changes the most. You have China, they remain sometimes for centuries almost the same. And the same as many other cultures. So change is not something that happens all the time. It actually, the general tendency is that it happens very slowly. Whereas in the Western world, for complicated reasons, we have one epoch making novelty after another. And that has given people in the West this notion that, oh, change is who we are, and this diversity is the next step in our change. And they don't know that this is the one that's going to obliterate them. But, you know, you had the Renaissance, you had the discovery of the world, you had the Enlightenment, you have representative institutions, the Reformation. So all these were changes that are unique to the European continent. And that is taught to people. I know, I see it, academics go, you understand now, student, change has always been part of your history, and I guess now we're changing and Canada could become half Chinese and just the way it is. But that's not the way it is. This is an engineered program from the top, implemented from above. It doesn't allow dissent. Professors are absolutely brainwashed the most brainwashed group in our society, because they read and they keep getting more and more brainwashed, and they call it critical thinking. That's the amazing thing.
If I'm not mistaken, you could say the same, say all of those same things about the French Revolution. So you wouldn't argue that that's not an authentic part of the...
It is a part of French
It is an
history.
authentic part of the history,
Yeah.
right? Okay, so how does one exactly evaluate whether a historical change is an authentic part of the development versus an inauthentic part of the development? How do you actually evaluate that?
You speak of the French Revolution. Before the French Revolution, there were no ideologies. There were no isms. Socialism, liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, they all came out of the French Revolution. And ideologies are like thoughts that intellectuals concoct and write about, and then they impose on reality. Before, things came from the ground up. No one was really planning it. The Renaissance was not planned. It just happened. So with the French Revolution and after, it's when you see the Western world obsessing and thinking they can create an ever more perfect reality. And then the world wars happened, and that shocked them. And they, like Trudeau, they came up with this idea that one of the problems that stands as an obstacle against continuous progress and enlightenment is ethnic divisions in the world. And they're just making it far worse, because before you had ethnic divisions between nations and within some nations. But they decided that by bringing many ethnic groups into one nation, you solve those ethnic divisions. But the research that's coming out is that it is making things worse. But their plan is, we really are going to mix them so much that then we'll get rid of the ethnic division.
So it's the degree to which it's interest.
Yeah. I'll take another question, yes.
Yeah, you talk about engineering from above. Professor Kevin McDonald's book, Cultural Critique, he thoroughly analyzes this. He pretty much proves that in 1965 the immigration laws were changed. United States, Canada, Western Europe, bringing a lot of non-white immigration without any democratic consultation. And his evidence is quite clear that it's the Rothschild Zionists, so this rich national Jewish power which engineered this since like 1924 to 1965. We didn't have any change in immigration, and international Jewish borders were pushing for this. And their motive quite clearly seems to be very deep hatred for white European Christian society by the international Jews. This seems to be at the very foundation of everything you're talking about, top-down, globalism.
Well, I'm not going to get into a Jewish question right now. I think I said enough here. But I will say this. I disagree that it is at the foundation. I have no problems if you say this is an interesting piece of the puzzle, a rather big piece that you're going to have to pay attention to, because there are a number of pieces. The Enlightenment and the way Europeans themselves started thinking, you can see it in those Coca-Cola commercials from the 70s. That's coming from them. And so there's a number of pieces of the puzzle. And let's leave that puzzle for another day. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know how I'm going to follow that. I just wrote this one down. So, Jordan Peterson once criticized a quote of yours claiming that it was too proud to attribute the success of a nation based upon the group to which one belongs. On the products of Western civilization. Am I proud of that? I didn't do that. What the hell? Pride. What's that? That's not the right response, he said. What would be your response to someone who believes that it is too proud to attribute Canada's success to European civilizational virtues and values?
Yeah, he's approaching it in a very individualistic fashion. He's thinking that if an individual carries the flag of her nation, and says, I'm really proud of my nation, that automatically that individual is laying claim to having accomplished what the nation accomplished, and that is not the case. It's a sense of being connected to that nation, of thinking I belong with that group. That is my group. I was born there. those are my people. So you sort of feel proud that they've done great things in your view and they are your people. And to me that's a very natural, normal, healthy attitude to have. Across all classrooms in Canada, not long ago, they tried to make children proud of what John A. McDonald had done, of the building of the railroads. They would have the flag of Canada. They took everything out, as you can see. Everything was taken out. And they would sing the anthem, again, to instill pride, a sense of attachment, a sense of belonging. Because of what the multiculturalists themselves say, or the liberal communitarians, that having a sense that you belong somewhere, that you're rooted somewhere, means a lot to a human being. So to me, pride is connected to that sense of in-group identity. I don't know what he's thinking too much in a commercialized way, and that's not.
Right, so just on furthering on that, on the flip side, what would you say to someone who is dealing with people who suggest that a group should deal with a cultural shame, historical shame? So pride will be condemned, but what about the shame aspect? That's normal.
Well, I know that recently he shamed some people collectively, but he doesn't like them to have pride collectively. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but he did that. But to your question, can you repeat that? That it should, about feeling shame?
Right, so
yeah.
what...
Okay, let's take the way in which natives were treated in Canada. You can talk about that and other incidents, but I do think that if a people is going to survive, you yourself, after reading about it, thinking about it, you're going to step out of that. You're not going to stay inside there all your life. No culture can be healthy if it only talks about what it perceives as being wrong. So I would just walk around, and at some point you have to shrug your shoulders about some things, because right now it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's just a barrage coming all day long. So if I have a student who looks like that, I got nothing to do with our religions. I did nothing wrong. I'm like, yeah, right. Don't worry about it. I tell the student.
So it's pragmatic for a civilization to surround itself with pride, but also ignore its shame.
So that you ignore the shame is that every nation has done nasty things. It was the Europeans who abolished slavery. So yes, they brought a lot of people across the Atlantic, but then they realized there was something morally wrong about it, and there were campaigns to abolish it, whereas no other nation did. So you have to teach it that way.
Neither should define you. Neither the pride that you feel for your ancestors should define you in a meaningful way. That's all there is to you. Then Jordan Peterson would be right. That would be tragic, right? But you should not feel guilt either for what your ancestors have done. That is not something you have ever had control over, nor should you be apologizing for.
Yes.
I come to this with the hope of finding some place where we can ally, where we can come to an agreement. And there, in my notes here, there are many things you've said that I disagree with, but for instance, that this culture severely goes against white pride. I don't think it does. But as to where we can find agreement, I would say perhaps on the issue of free speech. I think just about everyone in this room is for free speech and free expression. So in spite of our differences, we can agree to listen to each other. Another thing that we can come to an agreement about, I think, is the difficulties of immigration. So whether it's based on the idea of, oh, immigrants are bad and they're inferior to us, or on the basis of they're not bad and they're not inferior to us, but maybe we should integrate them better and have fewer, maybe fewer or more selected ones. So maybe there we can find a basis of unity on that because, well, I'm an immigrant to Canada myself, but I don't like to see some of the negative effects of some of the aspects of immigration.
I mean, if I understand you correctly, I'm past that in the sense that, like, Trump, to me, is great because he's created two very separate groups, and that's what I want to see. You're for diversity, you're in this group. You're for the whole cultural Marxism, sexual, changing sex. You're there, and then the other group is here. And I don't like the mainstream Republican who's wishy-washy between. I prefer the leftists who lays it out, and then Trump lays it out. And Trump is creating a political dynamic that will create a quasi-civil war situation. And that's where we are heading, and I prefer that than a slow death without any rebellion. Because right now,
Here, here.
you see someone was going to say something.
But what's your program? Do you have a program like positions on Marxism, positions on immigration, positions
Yeah.
on multiculturalism? In your book?
If I could put it in a word, and I end it that way, is whites have to affirm their ethnic identity or they're doomed. They're going to be annihilated. That's the way I see it.
But we could still have some immigration.
We'll see. I mean, we'll see, because right now, you know, there are a lot coming, and the plans are more coming, and they're going to increase it even more. Our side is not going to win anytime soon. So, for me, if white identity takes on, it's going to have an incredible rolling effect. Everything will fall into line. The stars, everything. So it's like a word. I'm not interested in putting down another group. I know sides that dedicate themselves to black criminality and make. I'm not interested in that, because then you're trying to, your identity is about putting another group, and that doesn't interest me. I'm more, there is a power vacuum. Whites are playing a universalist game that all the other groups are saying, we love what you're playing, and they play their own in-group identity and are allowed to do so, and whites are just kind of oblivious, saying individualism will do it, integration will do it, and I don't think it's going to do it. They have to say just a simple thing, that actually the history of Canada is a history in which EuroCanadians play the central role, or Anglo and then Quebecois. If the Anglo want that, that's fine. And that has to be said without equivocation. And if they say, what about the Aboriginals? Just repeat again, the Anglos and the Quebecois created Canada. Parliamentary institutions that came from Britain. To me, it's a question of affirming that which is yours, and it's part of your identity. Because you're caught up in a dilemma yourself. If you think you're the caretaker of humanity because you're white, then you think you have something special about you. And people on the left don't realize that. They really think that they're the caretakers of other people because they're not good enough. Oh, poor Mexicans, come, I'll do something for you because I'm a nice whitey, come. That's a very arrogant attitude. And you're caught up in that supremacist way of thinking.
Well, and if we have to do it, let's be paternalistic to get them. I mean, let's help them stay where they are and flourish. Rather than share, we can't even share amongst ourselves.
Yeah.
more cost effective.
Ricardo, what role do you see national broadcasters having in this whole situation? Such as CBC, which everybody here probably realizes is a propaganda machine.
CBC program.
I mean, it's the whole media is into it. It's an amazing phenomenon that only now have many people come to the realization that the right and the left are into the same game. They are globalists. They want diversity. They want it across the world. And so, I don't see a major media outlet questioning that narrative. CBCs, day in, day out, pushing and pushing this. So,
but the CBC was formed, as a cultural institution to combat the influence of major American radio stations, basically.
Right, it used to be nationalistic, and it's not anymore.
But if you wanted to look at if you wanted to pick out an anti-nationalist organization in Canada, it's our CBC right now. And anybody here can probably point to all kinds of examples where, you've just got a continuous assault on our history. We're good for nothing. We have done nothing, good in our past.
Yeah.
Here are all our sins. Let's get down on our knees, apologize.
And that's what I mean about identity. You reverse all of that. Let me take a question from here. Yes.
It's actually not exactly a question, just a few comments to what's been said. First of all, I think we can all agree that the French Revolution was mostly based on that volcano eruption and that it was the peasants revolting that had no food. Secondly, if we have a birth rate of 5.6 children per family, again, this is people that are living on the land and that need children to work at their farm, which they have found after they came from Europe, and they got some free land. Except that there was no infrastructure, like you said. Right. So the birth rates are very easily explained like that. So now we can go over, we don't really have to talk too much about Trudeau, I like the guy. But Chrétien, the Indian Act, now we're talking about citizenship, right? Citizenship rights for everyone, no matter whether they are natives or immigrants that have received citizenship, like myself and our drafter over there that had spoken before. And then we'll talk about DNA. I myself, for example, have 1/16 DNA that is Jewish, coming from Germany. I know that, and we need to look at that. And then, after the DNA question is resolved, we can start talking about individual preferences, such as myself wanting to be a nudist.
All right.
As an example. Okay, there should be freedom for that.
Yeah.
Because under the, human rights that we're talking about, even enlightenment that we're talking about, right? The enlightenment brings the multiculturalism, but then the multiculturalism should bring the enlightenment to the people that have immigrated, which is, obviously a big conflict that is not happening because people can barely read and write, even if they go to school here.
All right, that's a good point. Yes.
I was sufficiently impressed with your presentation that I think you should change your 8 claims to 8 facts.
All right.
Furthermore, I'd like to just touch on the words racism and white supremacist. It's been my experience that those words, racist, for starters, only applies to white people. I've never heard it claimed or said about any other race or nationality. And that sort of leads, I guess, to the white supremacist. I've never heard any other color of supremacist. It's only whites. And if we dare to stand up for our culture, well, as I think if I remember correctly, you pointed out in your presentation, for virtually every other culture or race, when they stand up proud of their nationality, their culture, we applaud them. Yeah. And yet if we dare do that about ourselves,
and you're going to have to do it because they're not going to do it for you. But I mean, white supremacy, the left has been really, really efficient at creating labels and words and controlling the narrative. And white supremacists, you did not hear that word too often. Now, it simply means a person in Norway who who says, I'm uncomfortable with bringing more immigrants. He's a supremacist, white supremacist. In other words, you must not let Norway be Norway. That in itself makes you a Nazi. It's just insane. But that's the way that word is used. We have a few words of our own, but they create more and more because they control all the universities, for one. They control the publishing houses. They control the journals. They control the conferences. They control everything. And it's slight deviation, they go hysterical and crazy at it. So our side doesn't have an ability through media to counter the absurdity of those words, how absurd they are. And they don't even explain what it means. And if you debate them, their arguments break apart very fast and they don't know what to say. Because it's a really stupid argument to say that the Japanese are not supremacists, but the people in Norway are. It makes no sense at all.
How do we get rid of them? Those people that are controlling this.
Oh, how do we get rid of them? Well, you know, I go back to Trump. I think the Trump phenomenon is really, really great because he's the one politician that doesn't back down and continuously creates a mini crisis almost every day. And so he is radicalizing the population. And the left is right. Trump is a politics of implicit whiteness. And to me, that's good enough. So
even though he's in such support of Israel by declaring Jerusalem as his capital.
yeah, but it wouldn't be in his interest. I believe in the state of Israel, by the way, in the sense that every nation, every people should have a place, a state. But you have to be pragmatic. Trump has played that card very well. I'm not going to get into it too much, but he's played the whole Jewish thing very well. He's very astute in the head. Yes?
You mentioned how multiculturalism is being taught top-down, and I can give a few concrete examples about that. Last year I was in a teacher education program at the University of the Fraser Valley, and we were taught to teach our students that we should celebrate all these whole list of holidays from other cultures, but not Christmas, because it might offend people. Also, we were taught to teach the history of other countries because it was so unfair that students should be coming to Canada and not being taught their own history. And we were taught to teach them how to tear down our statues and all the bad things that white people had done in Canada. Also, we had to write diversity into all our unit plans, every single one, even in physics, which was what I was teaching. And when I asked questions about it in class, I was told I was not allowed to express my opinion or ask questions.
Yes, and at my university, okay, let's not talk about my university, but at universities generally, I have heard from students that are going into education who have said that to me. Diversity is now inscribed into the curriculum. Social justice is inscribed into it. In other words, you're not just going to be a teacher of math and English. You have to be a social justice teacher, and you must teach about the greatness of diversity. And what you just said there is what multiculturalism means. It means really celebration of everyone else except the country that decided to celebrate everyone else. And so what has to happen is not to simply say that multiculturalism is wrong, it's but to say that within the very premises of multiculturalism, you have the possibility of all-out white identity politics. It's right there, it's written in the Constitution. Joseph Magnet, he's known as one of Canada's foremost constitutional experts. He basically says it, that the Charter of Rights does give collective rights to groups to keep enhancing themselves and growing, even to the point that they may go against individual rights that they perceive as a threat to their collective identity. So, and then he says this is a very deeply held psychological need for cultural groups to exist as collectivities. But he never turns around and says, oh, what about the EuroCanadians? He has no clue because he's been kind of trained not to even think about that, but you're gonna have to think about that. And rather than saying multiculturalism is bad, we should all assimilate and integrate, which to me is really bad as well. I mean, imagine if everybody integrated and assimilated in France, in England, and everywhere, everything is going to look like Toronto. It's not very good.
What do you think are the unintended consequences of cultural Marxism, like when you, like as far as like the pendulum theory is concerned? Like, because we're seeing more reactionary movements now that, for example, like I have some more experiences in university where it really seems like there's an era of intellectual authoritarianism. So I want to hear what your thoughts are as far as just how this rapid change in political thought and reactionary movements.
Yeah, and then the internet has accelerated the reaction. We're talking about there is a growing reaction against cultural Marxism and all these ideas. And yeah, there it is. And the left really has like a lid clamp on it and doesn't let anything to come out because they're very afraid of it. Like what she just said, they don't really have an answer to that. So they just shut it down. They incentivize those who are for it, give them grants, all kinds of perks, whereas they throw you out of your job, and that's how they keep that lid there. But slowly and in various ways, it seems to me there is no other choice but for EuroCanadians to affirm their collective cultural identity. Because the truth is that other groups do not respect people that don't. They're laughing. They can't believe it. And I know that Muslims look at white males and they think this is just ridiculous. This is for the taking, easy things. So if you affirm it, they're going to respect you. They're going to say, well, this person has pride, speaking of pride, has pride in who he is, and he wants to affirm it, and he's not telling me, oh, I'm a Muslim, let me hear about you, oh, you're so good, and you're not going to do any of that. It's just about your culture, your heritage, and that's it.
It seems like the way they rationalize that pride is they pin it to like an inferiority complex or something like that, which is an accusation that once again seems to only be applied to European, like Western Europeans.
Yeah, they use the term white fragility when you react to trap you, so that if you react and say, you know, my heritage is being threatened, they say, oh, poor you, poor little white male, and you need to man up and hand over more stuff. So so, you know, they're very good at creating words, and that's why you do need to read. Like, you don't need to become an intellectual, but you need some few solid facts about Canada's history. You need to put pictures of Canadians that you admire in your room. You need to put phrases. You need to connect, and the old flag of Canada, that kind of thing, to give you a sense that this is my identity, and eventually in time you can wear shirts that proclaim it to other people. Yes?
What do you think, what do you think kind of defines what you would call white identity politics in Canada? So like, when you kind of look at the United States, you look at issues such as gun control, size of government, freedom of speech. None of these issues are restricted to white people, but generally white Americans will favor these issues more. And you just see a racial divide. Of course, it doesn't mean that one group, they're exclusive to one group that others don't support it, but these are, you could say, implicitly white identitarian issues. In terms of Canada, what kind of issues do you think would hold us around white identity politics? You know?
There are a few things that the conservatives say. They do some of them defend gun rights in Canada. The Maxime Berger breakaway, if you gravitate in that direction, to me that's a form of implicit whiteness. You're looking for someone that's going to say a few more critical things about immigration, even though he's not doing it openly. But within his body, I think it is possible to build something. Even though he's not going to say it right now, you can, people like this can populate that party and make it their own, and that can happen. And then it becomes a party that speaks to the interest of people that are really concerned about diversity. I take one question here and then.
Oh, I was just going to comment on, we have 4 children, and we constantly feel the bombardment of us being bullied racist. For example, when my son was in elementary school, there's this one boy who kept on saying, "I'm true blood, you're nothing, I'm the true blood." So, of course, my son would stand up and be like, "You're absolutely wrong." He wouldn't say anything bad, he would just say, "You're wrong." He got pulled into the principal's office, and I got a call home from the principal saying that he was the racist one. So you can't,
Did you set them straight?
Oh, we did, but he constantly, she would always defend when he was being attacked on him being white. So he was always in trouble, and we constantly got calls home from the principal saying that he was in the wrong.
And that's just the beginning. Wait till whites go into the below 50 and 40s. It's all out annihilation because, and imagine when they're below 50, they're still playing the game. "No, I love diversity." They're just they're gonna laugh and they're gonna walk all over you. So, I just, to me, it's a question of affirming something that is legitimately yours. But you have to be careful because they have the power. Okay,
Yeah. There was an item in the newspaper a couple of weeks ago that the unhappiest people in Canada are in Vancouver and Toronto. 2 reasons: ultra high cost of housing and very long commutes to work because cheap housing is not near the place of work. Now, both of those characteristics are an inevitable consequence of massive immigration. Why is it we can't say, "I don't want more immigrants, I want to be able to buy a home"? Or alternatively, "Hey, these people are coming here to our culture. They're not moving to South Asia or East Asia or Latin America or Africa or the Muslim world. They're coming here. Why are they coming here? Because our culture is superior." What's wrong with saying that?
Right. Again, that shows that there has never been, I study history, and there has never been a more pathological regime in power than the one we have now. It really, I cannot hear CBC or watch news because I can't deal with that insanity. Yes, it's just so extreme. They are the extremists.
How do you encourage young people to say, "Don't be afraid to speak up. I want to buy a home. I don't want more immigrants raising the cost of housing"?
Slowly, you got to talk. You got to say to people, it's not going to be easy. Okay, I'll take a question there.
A little confused because you're saying that the culture and ethnic destruction of the West is orchestrated and planned. Are you implying that it's a small group of people orchestrating this, but then you were saying as well that there was widespread ethno-national fear after World War II to as well explain this? Like,
yeah,
what are you using to explain this? Is it a small group, widespread fear? Like,
yes, it happens at many levels with different motivations. You have many naive, well-meaning students who think diversity is good. They don't know the full picture, but they're pushing it. And they themselves will not want another student to give a different opinion and think that's racist. And they just think at that level. I'm saying the right things. It would be nice to have diversity. We'll get along. I'm not racist. I have friends from all kinds of races. There are many people of that level. Then you have the feminists. They're concentrating more on the fact that they think white men are still too powerful. They control too many resources in our society, and they need to be challenged, and they need to emasculate them more and raise them differently.
So no more men on the move.
Yeah, but you get the point that it happens at that level among the feminists. Then you have a person looking at it from a strictly economic point of view. Whether you're a real estate owner, a lawyer, you think bringing more people is more business, it's more action. That's good.
Capitalism.
Yes, and they see it only at that level. Then you go higher up and you have people that do see a lot of the connections, and they're obsessed with breaking the back of white majorities in the United States, in England, and Australia.
Could you be more specific about who you mean by that?
They say it, they laugh at it. They say, look at the statistics. Those poor Trump voters, don't they realize that their days are numbered? Even Steven Pinker, I have an article about him on his last book. Steven Pinker, who supposedly is kind of on the right, but Steven Pinker said, he has an expression in which he says, well, eventually, grave by grave, our ideas will rule. Meaning as more and more whites die and they become a smaller proportion of the population, this universal enlightenment idea is going to take over. And the United States will be totally diversified. So the ones that are opposing us now are ignorant country white hicks that vote for Trump, but the young generation we have in our universities, they're with us, and they're kind of, cosmopolitan and open-minded and tolerant, and that's the next generation. So there are people that see the demographic trends. What happened just now in the last elections, in the House, the people who were elected, the majority in the House of Representatives, for the first time many minorities were elected, and you see now clear-cut non-whites moving into the Democratic Party, and whites into the Republican Party even more. So they look at that and they see the trends and they say, this is a party of the future, that's a party of the past. And it may well be because demography, as August Comte used to say, is destiny, but you have to add ethnicity to it. It is destiny. The balance of power is shifting very fast, and parties that advance and promote the ethnic interests of blacks, of Hispanics, you name it, are going to be in power. And so the people who think about this have a kind of a wider picture of the dynamics, but not everyone sees the full picture. So it's not as it was. Sometimes people ask me about Pierre Trudeau. When Pierre Trudeau introduced multiculturalism, he never could have envisaged UBC as it is today, basically a Chinese university. He could not have possibly seen such a thing. And you wonder, would he have gone ahead with it if they had told him that is what's going to happen? He did not see that. So he took a step thinking, okay, minority rights. Let's acknowledge the Ukrainians and this other group, and we'll just get along better. Let's bring a few people from Jamaica, from India, just a few people. Now we get into Justin Trudeau, and we are into full pathology at this point, and you have moved a lot further than Pierre had even thought it would be possible. So there is what I call in my book a spiral that is going and going, and you can see the left getting crazier and crazier with time. And so many people are caught up in that spiral, and some see aspects of it, and some see more aspects of that spiral.
Well, here's the thing. This is like an ideological agenda. It's not something that it's a grand conspiracy. All these people agree with each other, right? It's they go to the big universities and they get, well, this is the official ideology, and some people buy into it, some people don't. But if you buy into it, there's a lot of incentive to buy into it because you get a professorship, you get a big job at a big tech company. There's real financial incentives for buying into this narrative. And in reactionary circles, this is called the cathedral, the media, the Hollywood, everything that kind of helps the education system, everything that helps to shape the public consciousness, public opinion, is called the cathedral. So there's incentives, and they all agree with each other. Like, you know, when people are like Alex Jones, he got kicked off of all the big tech companies, all the social media, because he went against the narrative. So it's not some vast conspiracy, but they all agree with each other. Like, I'm going to a event here in a couple weeks by a talk by a former ambassador to Canada to Spain, and his talk is like, oh no, this evil populism that is happening in Europe, it can happen here. He's really worried about that. He's going to talk about it from a cautionary tale. So it's not like I said, they just all have this world opinion, because if they didn't have this world opinion, they wouldn't have high status, because that's kind of a prerequisite for being in a status position in our society.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for your personal bravery to bring this to the discussion. It's very rare, especially in this country. I've got a few points I'd like to discuss. First is called the third wave or third wave. Second is Aaron Russo. I'd like to start with the Kudenov-Kalergi plan. I'm sure you're aware of that.
The what?
The Kudenov-Kalergi plan.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain on it, or would you like me to discuss it?
You can say a few words to them about it.
Yeah. Well, there was a aristocrat, Kudenov-Kalergi, I can't remember his first name. He was half Japanese and half Austrian, I believe. He came up with the premise. The thing that he wants to spell it out for you is Coudenhove. K-A-L-E-R-G-I, the Copernican plan. His premise, and you have to understand there's many schools of thought, such as the Frankfurt School and all these other, these things came out of an incubation of some schools of thought. His plan, he says, the best way to deal with this I guess you would call it the European problem, is to read them out. Basically, this is about the 1920s, he said. The best way is to bring in other cultures, non-European cultures, this is his words, not mine, and bring them into Europe, so that we will basically, as we're alluding to here, we will read out cultures, we will read out everything else.
Yeah.
So just bring in a new gene pool, and all the cultures that took 1,000 years to develop will just disappear. And that's from the 1920s. And you're so you heard of the Frankfurt School. With Dr. Duchesne's lecture, I've done a lot on par with you, but I've actually gone back into ancient history. And this is not a new plan. I'm not sure what your history is showing. This goes back literally since man created different ethnic racial groups. This goes back into ancient Egypt. There is writing, I think it's called the Kuru or the Armani letters, where an Egyptian was lamenting that he had a very sophisticated society, and yet the people were starving. They had many skilled people that were starving because they had brought in outsiders into the country. This leads to the discussion of the third wave. If this is something maybe some of you have heard about, third wave or third wave, effectively cultures and countries either were led by the throne or the altar. No, that's history. You either had the king ruling or the religious groups ruling. And what had happened is, I'll just be very politically correct, call it the hand in the glove. These are the hidden powers behind the scenes. They would pit countries, one culture versus the other. They had a war, and what they found was this is not helping in their world domination. What was occurring was one group would win, and the other would lose. And the group that won, it galvanized the culture, so they became even stronger. And this affected the plan for global domination.
But the Kalergi plan, to stick to it, because some of them may be familiar with that.
Yeah.
I am familiar with it, and a student who completed a PhD with me has a chapter on the Kalergi plan. So she dig into the whole thing.
Okay.
I don't believe that Kalergi envisioned what is transpiring today. I just believe that there were many Europeans that looked at the First World War and then the Second World War, and they felt something had to be done. We cannot have the nation states of Europe going after each other in such a violent way. And I relate to that. I am a cosmopolitan person, but cosmopolitanism has also been infiltrated by the cultural Marxists and turned into something else. But cosmopolitanism means a federation of European nations so that they learn to coexist with each other, and their roots going back to the Congress of Vienna, attempts to really avoid disastrous wars. In the case of the Congress of Vienna was the Napoleonic Wars. So there is that side in Kalergi. Now he did say that in the future I see people race mixing a lot more, and then he kind of thought it could be a better species, and he sort of thought about that. But I wouldn't say that he's writing down and saying, I'm really going to develop a plan whereby I will push for the elimination of the European race and creating a race breed, a new race breed. He just envisioned that.
Eurasian Negroid.
Yeah, he used a word like that. So, speaking of puzzle, he's part of that puzzle.
Yeah.
But people have this need to grab and say it's the Kalergi plan, it's the Frankfurt School. That's one that's always brought up. But the Frankfurt School was one school among many others. For example, I think that the theory of underdevelopment has been a critical factor as well. The notion that the West became rich by exploiting the rest of the world. That's taught continuously everywhere, and it's really not true. That's not how the West became rich. But it is one more aspect in persuading many people that Europeans did something unfair and bad, and now they're paying the price of it by getting a lot of people from impoverished nations that the whites impoverished coming at them. So they use that. So that's another argument. And feminism is another argument, and postmodernism is another current. So you combine all these currents and you have a sweeping set of ideas and schools. I was taught by a guy who teaches history from below. So he emphasizes the common illiterate artisans, peasants, that role they play in history. So it makes you think, oh, they are the best, they are the suffering, and they are getting into history, and we should let them get more into history. So now, so many other groups have been added. I mean, when you talk about transsexuals, it's about that. Get them into history as an agent that hasn't spoken yet. And they keep adding one after another. And meanwhile, people forget about the peaks, the highest. Universities should be places in which you're taught to look up to that which is very high. The great thinkers, great architecture, great paintings, great achievements. They don't do that. They say, just look at the drug addicts and why are they drug addicts and that kind of thing. Or look at this transsexual or this other little group there. And you can do that, that's fine. But unless people see that which is high, like I like to talk about explorers and conquerors and those people that are right up there, and then that gives people a sense of identity and a sense of greatness, which is important for them.
I just want to finish once I have here.
It's okay, it's just another guy out there.
Thanks for coming to speak to us tonight, and thank you for your lecture. I just wanted to ask if you have any points to make on the current political situation in Canada when it comes to an electoral pathway ahead. I've spent almost 20 years in Canadian politics, and I have quite a bit of experience. And from what I see, I don't believe that there is a pathway forward in Canada in any way connected or associated on the American model or even the European model. I think you might agree that multiculturalism in Canada is well entrenched, and I would even say is fortified. Not because I think that the elites at one point in the past thought that there would be a great reaction, but that because there has never been any real resistance in Canada, they've been able to entrench and fortify to a greater degree than any other Western country. And when you look at our, I have not read your book, so you may go into this in your own writing, but when you look at our collective history, you know, Canada wasn't a nation state founded on a Enlightenment constitutional model, you know, on the you know, philosophy of Jefferson and Locke, and you know, et cetera, et cetera. I see Canada as kind of a commercial resource frontier state, you know, that was settled and expanded by the Hudson's Bay Company for wealth to be extracted on behalf of, you know, the empire. And so our traditions are much more locked down in terms of our rights, in terms of our participation. I don't think, personally, I don't think, after 20 years of politicking, I don't think the Canadians understand how little say and power they have, aside from voting, in the outcome of the elections, in the outcome of governments, and the destiny of our nation. You know, the party politics is very strict. You know, becoming a candidate, forming your own party, ascending to power is extremely difficult. And you know, when we look at the federal and provincial scene, you know, the human rights commissions in certain provinces, tribunals in all provinces, limit the expression of speech and organization, political advocacy for whites or Europeans. And so, anyway, I'm diverging, but I'm unclear of the path forward. I'm looking at Maxime Bernier, I'm looking at forming, you know, different parties. Europe, you know, has many populist parties that are rising, that are now in coalition or forming government, but they have a long history of different types of governments, different possibilities. A lot of these countries, Austria, France, Spain, Italy, Germany, of course, have had reactionary governments. They've had fascism, they've had National Socialism. So it's not outside the realm of possibility when a former ambassador for Spain comes to lecture us. Well, he knows full well about the revolution and what happened in Spain. That won't happen here in Canada. There'll be no resistance, there'll be no reaction, there'll be no popular party, there'll be no, it just won't happen. So I don't know what your program or prescription is for Canada, but it doesn't look good.
Civil War. Yeah, Canada is the furthest into this experiment and way of thinking. And if any nation is going to allow itself to completely disappear first and totally, it is Canada. I agree with you. Whereas Australia, even though I think that the proportion of non-whites is slightly higher there than it is here, Australians have a stronger sense of national identity, and you see even from high-up politicians reacting against it. Mm-hmm. So you're right. I would simply say that one good way is to get into the Bernier group and bring these ideas slowly and gradually, so the people in the ground shape the ideology, that way of thinking of that party. But because in time things are going to begin to get more agitated. There's going to be greater room for these ideas, I think. The other thing I would say is that you can play identity politics every day by small little things that you do, even the way you dress, where you go, and what you eat, and simple things like that. In other words, there could be a process of forming parallel societies whereby, like the, what's that religion, those people that... The Spanish, what is it? Amish. Yeah, I'm not saying exactly like that. You can have that, so you kind of preserve yourself and don't bother anybody, but you're obviously practicing the politics that is self-preservation for your people. So you can do things that don't appear to be that important. You gotta get married and you gotta have children, you gotta build a family. That also is important. Even though I know it's hard, you're producing children and then you transmit these ideas to them. So there are many things you can do at an individual level. And just the joy of not giving in to them. Like the student here, how could you allow your brain to accept this absurd nonsense? Like for me, it's that. It's just, I walk in universities, not my university, but I walk in universities and I'm like, there's no way that they're gonna think I'm so stupid that I believe the nonsense they're teaching. So it's just a matter of you saying, you didn't get me, kind of thing.
We have time for about 2 more questions.
Okay, he and him then.
One thing I've noticed, especially recently, in the last couple of years, is advertising in Canadian retail. So, like, you can go to Nike.ca or Abercrombie&Fitch.ca or any Canadian shopping mall and look at the posters. There's virtually zero white males now.
Yeah.
But there's a huge overrepresentation of black males.
Yeah.
So I was in Mark's work warehouse the other day, and almost every sign in the store was at a black male. So you'll see a lot of black males, particularly black males with white females.
Right.
And it's odd because they're only 3% of the Canadian population.
Right.
So you would think if they were doing that for sales, that would be kind of counter to that, because they'd be missing a huge base. So I was wondering if you have any insight, who is behind that advertising push against white males, and why? Like, what's the motivation?
Okay.
Echo.
That's the audience.
The people who do this don't know the full picture, but obviously once you break the back of white males, then the country's for the taking.
So they see us as kind of the last vanguard?
Yes, white males, because males always are the ones that protect a society. If you weaken the males, women can't do it.
Because what's too, like, it's not like you're seeing Asian males or Hispanic males replacing
No,
us.
they're targeting white males.
But what I'm saying is, so there's a lack of white male representation in advertising, but we're not being replaced by, say, the growing Asian male population. We're being replaced specifically by mostly black males.
No, in the mixing, yes, in the mixing, because...
So, but why black?
Because it's a sexual thing. It means that he has more prowess than you, and so he takes your women, and so the white male feels like even more humiliated. There are people that are thinking along those lines, is to utterly destroy them, psychologically, physically, so that they give up. At the same time that they don't allow them to speak.
Because now I don't even want to go into shopping centers.
Right, and when he was saying that, that's the thing you gotta do. You will not shop in that place. You shop in the place where the ads don't show that. So you have to do it like that, bit by bit. Like, you're not gonna take me. I know you are against me for who I am, and you don't buy into it. But this, it's a lot of pieces, and so destroy the white man is a key.
So as far as those, so these would be I guess like Marx or Nike or Puma, they would go to advertising agencies, and I guess it's the agencies themselves that are running this, or are they doing it as a response to social justice warriors?
It's all kinds of people get in. Pedophiles, pornographers are part of the whole thing. They're just all in.
Yeah.
I mean, you see the Macron from France getting all ecstatic, jumping when the Africans won for him, for his team. It's all over the place, and that mindset is not just simply the advertisement and the shopping. It manifests itself in French culture generally, that they decided that black athletes are better than the French and should play for them, and they're going to celebrate them. And
I wonder why that specific group though, blacks. Like, why not East Indians? Why not? Is it because they're so opposite?
Last question.
Yeah, they're very opposite. That's one reason. They tend to be good at sports. Overall, they're not better at sports than whites, but they're good in some sports. So they
more threatening.
Yeah. Did you say here? Okay, one question here.
It's just a quick question. I noticed I've gone to spiritual communities, non-denominational, and I'm sure it extends beyond that. But there seems to be a prevalence in the saying that we are all the same. We are all the same. They say it over and over.
Yes.
So I just wanted to know your thoughts.
Yes, another thing, it's called interfaith dialogue. Yes, that's,
Even go as far as
yes.
doing opinions.
So the idea is
Oh.
that in Christian nations, and only Christian nations, they are promoting the growth of other religions. And then they tell the Christians, this is good for you, now you can do interfaith. Meanwhile, Muslim nations don't have any interfaith, just Islam. And you see it here, Kari just showed me a road here where you have this massive mosque, and now the Chinese, I didn't know they had a religion, now they had a huge building of their beliefs. So, and they have the whiteys thinking, wow, we're all getting along, look at that.
Some
And,
of the spiritual communities, they actually educate independent.
and what makes a religion interesting is the difference between it and another religion. Otherwise, it is not a religion. Other religions don't have Jesus Christ, and that makes Christianity interesting. The whole concept, you don't have to believe in Christianity, but the whole concept. So without the differences, the interfaith dialogue is just dilute everything to the lowest common denominator.
All right, that's the last one. So I'd like to thank everyone for